Here's an idea. Let's not get crazy.
Hello, Karen. How's it going?
Hey, Wes. I'm good. How are you?
Good, good. So this is going to be, I think, a relatively short podcast, but I was struck. The last few weeks have been very interesting watching all of these memes come out about the World Cup, and
Oh,
in particular,
it's so inspiring.
Europeans.
Yeah,
It really
so
is, and
inspiring.
it's of course it's fun because it validates our view of America
hmm
and our
hmm
view of Western civilization. But
hmm
it struck me as so interesting because the vast majority of these memes are not political. They're just Europeans shocked at how America is compared to how they were
Yeah.
told America
Yeah.
was by the
Yeah.
elites.
Yeah. And what is, I'm so curious. I lived there in 98 and in England. And I wonder about how different it is now that it would be so striking to them. Like the perception of Americans in 98 was they were so excited to hear if I was from Texas. They thought I was part of Dallas, and there was this sort of like cultural sweetness, fascination with our positivity. And I'm hearing that in these memes, but also having a Scottish husband now, he says, our worlds weren't that different in 98. But from 98 till now, it must be shockingly different over there, not only because the message, but their economy. Like, my question is, what is the media telling them about us? Like, it's a wasteland? Is that what you've heard when you've seen these?
Well, that it's what I get from my British coworkers is that America is a very violent place. It's a very racist place.
Oh, yeah.
It's you can't be out on the street at night. People shooting each other, and that we're kind of reactionary and backward. And I think, of course, a lot of these Europeans are saying, "Well, that's not the experience we're getting at
Yeah.
all when we're coming
Well,
over here."
I mean, what you just described is every progressive city. So every progressive city,
Yeah,
yes, it's actually true. Like
that's a good
you're
point.
perceived of as racist, or that's the ideology that the progressive city is acting from. It is dangerous to go out. I moved from a small, very progressive city because it was dangerous to go out and we were attacked regularly, and it's still happening now. So I think it's interesting that it's primarily the South. I mean, it seems like people are looking at Montana. They're driving through the country. They're going to Mississippi and Alabama. These are the states we never hear positive things about. So it's conservative America that they're visiting, actually.
Yeah, yeah, and it's been funny. It's been fun to see all the rednecks with their
Yeah,
fishing boats and their gun ranges, inviting
it's the
these
best.
Europeans out to come
It's the best.
experience America.
I know.
Well, setting aside the kind of the political
Mhm,
it aspect of this, which is really quite interesting.
mhm.
It struck me. I've been thinking a lot about the power of ideas, and as I've been reading Michael Schellenberger's pieces recently on Western civilization
Yeah.
and anti-civilization forces which are afoot, it's interesting. I always wonder how could Chinese children turn in their parents knowing they were going to be sent off to re-education camps and forced labor camps. And it was because they became enamored with an idea which was revolutionary and transcendent, and it ended up overwhelming their intuition, the love that they had for their families and for their parents. And I think of a small version of that, or maybe a less dramatic version of that, if you have a European perspective, right, a traditional kind of European perspective, and you got that perspective from media outlets and from
No.
politicians and from people in academia, you're going to have a cynical perspective, not just on America. America is going to represent Western civilization broadly.
Yeah.
And so you're going to have a very cynical perspective on that world, on that society, because that's what you've been told.
Yeah.
But then, of course, you experience things entirely differently.
Mhm.
And you get all these memes generated because of
Yeah.
that. But I thought it was interesting in the context of the psychedelic community, because that's, of course, what our
Mhm.
podcast is about, is that I've been in the community now for 3 years. There's definitely a monoculture there. And that culture does perceive Western society in a glass half empty way. It's not, they don't think fairly optimistically about our society. And to the extent that they don't want to completely overthrow it, they want to dramatically alter it, including a lot of the things that I think these Europeans, sorry about that. Okay, well, actually, let's see here. Where are we at? We're at
546.
546. We'll have to, ironically, that was Gabriel. That was Gabriel calling.
I didn't even hear it, actually, but yeah.
Okay, we'll start again.
Okay.
Let's see, what was I talking about? Shoot, what was it?
Gosh.
And the monoculture in the psychedelic community. And okay, here we go. And those that don't want to overthrow the Western civilization as we know it are at least at a minimum hostile to some of the foundational aspects of that civilization. The very things that a lot of the Europeans coming over here are experiencing and appreciating. And so I found it interesting that in the psychedelic world, we have trended towards seeing the glass half empty, if not completely empty in some situations.
Well, and I think the glass is hostile. I mean, it's perceived of as the glass is hostile and oppressing you,
Right.
And I'm sorry to interrupt you. I'm excited because I've been thinking about this.
That's fine. Yeah.
I've been thinking about this too. And we were just talking about this earlier, is how interesting that the psychedelic world, if it had entered through another medium besides therapy, maybe there would be a different viewpoint. It's hard to know, but because it's entered the mainstream through therapy, and therapy has been so fully captured that it has to go through that filter. And that filter is that white people are inherently racist. Organized culture, Western civilization in particular, is particularly oppressive to the natural world. So I think it's because it has entered through the vehicle of therapy, and the clinical trials are all based in the therapeutic work, that it has this flavor.
Do you think that therapeutic ideal, or the one that is now becoming mainstream within the therapeutic community, of problems are systemic, people don't have a whole lot of individual agency, is that coloring the broader perspective within the psychedelic community of kind of a helplessness or a need to engage in revolutionary activity, a need to engage in dramatic deconstruction of the framework that they're living in? Is that do you think that's where it's coming from, out of the therapeutic side?
I do. I think, there's the shift of mindset that happens in a psychedelic experience where the frame is enlarged, right? Like you described in your psychedelic experience. Suddenly you have access to more information about your situation. And then it's interpreted through the therapist framework. And the therapist framework, because it's activist therapists, 90% of therapists are progressively liberal. And especially the niche that does psychedelia, I think, is progressively liberal. And that viewpoint says people are oppressed by external systems. They wouldn't frame it this way. This is the confusing part, I think, is that therapists would say, no, we're empowering people to get through their trauma. We've got these classical clinical skills that psychedelics help. But what's actually happening in the therapy that I've seen and the therapists I've talked to is that they are subtly positioning the client as a victim to society. And they're more likely to say, cut off contact with society, cut off contact with anyone who disagrees with you. Go through the world feeling like a victim. You've had this psychedelic enlightenment experience, let's say, or at least reducing your trauma experience. And now you can go through knowing, just being very clear about how oppressive society is. And so you must now advocate for others who are oppressed. I think that's the end goal of the psychedelic healing, as I've been thinking about it lately, is creating client activists. Because all of our rules and guidelines in the therapy world have been rewritten to say that it is our therapeutic role to advocate for our client in an oppressive society. It actually says that in our codes now. And so I think that the natural extension of that is clients are viewed as victims and therefore have to be advocates for dismantling society. That's so dangerous, because what the World Cup memes are telling us is reality, which is we are actually connected. We are actually Americans, not far left or far right or liberal or Democrat or whatever. We are Americans. And I think if you sit down and do a psychedelic journey with a neutral, at least neutral, let's say moderate therapist, you're going to get a very different outcome than client outcome than if you're sitting with a progressively liberal therapist who makes you feel like a victim.
Let me ask you a question about that in the therapeutic world. I want to straw man
Mm,
the position that our society is making us ill. Our
hmm.
society is creating trauma, and
Yeah.
we therefore have to change our society in order to overcome that trauma. What about the argument that modern society does create unique ills that we experience as humans? Consumerism, alienation,
Hmm.
breakdown of the family. These
Yeah.
are these are ills that you and I would agree with
Hmm.
exist in our society, and they affect people. The stress levels that we have because of the modern way in which
Yeah.
we live in our digital
Yeah.
world are real. How would you answer that critique of modern society in a
Hmm.
traditional framework versus a critical theory framework?
Sure. I think it's a very fair argument to say that industrialization and digitalization has led to this. And what I would say the difference is to the things that you described is that a progressively liberal therapist who outsources agency to external systems would say you are a victim to that and therefore it needs to be destroyed and recreated with no good idea about how it is recreated. When you say traditional therapist, I think I'm non-traditional at this point. A conventional
Okay.
therapist is more progressive. A non-traditional therapist is like the 20% that are moderate or conservative. And we would say you're outsourcing your agency to an external non-entity like a society, when actually what's true is that this has happened throughout all of human evolution. And what is true is that you have agency and your ingenuity will help change the outcome. So we relocate that source of agency to the inside, to an internal framework. Yes, you have pain and it's difficult for you to lose your job because it's being outsourced to AI. How will you use your human ingenuity, your human grit and resilience to solve that problem? Because that is the truth of what we've been doing since the beginning of time is solving these issues that come up. They look a little different now, but I think it would be insourcing agency versus outsourcing it and going to revolution. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that does. And it's interesting how I've seen, I'm sure you've seen some of the same surveys that people that tend to be left of center that are very tend to be much more skeptical about the future.
Yeah.
And they also tend to not want to have as many kids or have kids at all. And people right of center that are more optimistic about the future tend to want to have
Hmm.
kids, want to have families. And it's just so interesting how, to me, that if you have a perspective that is disempowering, that there's these systemic forces at play
Yeah.
and you have no control over them, that's obviously going to lead you to a very pessimistic view of your ability to change things. And it makes sense that you wouldn't want to have children and bring them into that kind of a world that you not only can't control, but you don't feel that anybody can control,
Yeah.
because you think that there are these forces out there that are moving, these systemic forces that are inherently corrupt,
Yeah.
power-based, evil.
Yeah.
And what I find interesting about critical theory is that I actually find it an interesting theory to
Hmm.
describe certain aspects of how we organize ourselves socially, but it's not the entire picture. And I think
Yeah.
that's probably where people in the psychedelic community get it wrong, is
Yeah.
that they feel that it's the only filter through which they can view reality, and
Yeah.
it tells them everything
The
about
full
reality.
story. It reminds me of working with an anxious client who's got a lot of stories about the future, but they only believe the negative ones. And that's what's
Yeah.
producing the anxiety. When actually the other stories are also equally as true or as possible. But for whatever reason, their focus until they come to therapy or they get this other feedback, like, oh, it could actually happen a different way than what I am fearful of. It reminds me of a similar worldview, is that
Mm.
all these things I think are true, is that we do have corrupt society. We do have corrupt politicians. We do have imbalances in economical equality or access. But the way to go about it, from my perspective, is not to collapse into it and have a tantrum about it and then say it's all bad and across the board, but is to find the things that we can do in it. Just like I would say to an anxious client, find the things you have control over in your world. Get up at a certain time,
Mm.
take a walk at a certain time. These are the things you control. And then that builds confidence that you actually are a person with agency and vision and hope. And hope is
Hmm.
like a habit, you know? You have to exercise your hope. You can't just expect it to be imbued in all of your thinking. I think you have to practice it.
I love this notion that of how powerful a story is that you tell yourself. Like you
Yeah.
said, your
Mhm.
client that someone told me, I think it was 2 days ago. You probably heard this meme before. It's what a ADHD person says is it's not important. It's not important if you ever finish your project as long as you do it perfectly. Or it's not important.
Right.
It's not
Right.
important how many projects you have going as long as you do them perfectly.
Yeah.
And it's when you have that mindset, it takes you down a certain
Yeah.
path
Yeah.
of activity of behavior. And I just find that the power of ideas
Yeah.
fascinating because I have people in my family that are both left of center and right of
Mm.
center. And the right of center people are much more optimistic. They're much more kind of feeling that they are in charge of their
Mm.
lives, even if perhaps they're not.
Mhm.
But they tend to be happier. And then I have people on the left of center, very smart people. There's one a dear cousin of mine. I was telling her about my daughter, whose fiance is from a Muslim country that's very unstable and very
Mm.
unsafe for her to visit as a
Mm.
female, as an American, as a
Mm.
female that's not willing to wear the headdress. She would be inviting herself to be raped or attacked or worse. And when I mentioned this to my left of center cousin, I said, or her response was, "You mean she'd be in as much danger as she is in America?" And I said,
Woo.
"No, she'd be in a lot more danger as a female there than she would be an American." And she said, "Well, why do you think that?" And I said, "Because I understand math." And
Yeah.
I and
Yeah.
I look at
Yeah.
the numbers,
Yeah.
and I know what happens to women in Muslim countries, especially those that are run by Sharia law, which this country in particular is. And it's so interesting. This is a very, very smart woman, but she is been raised on New York Times
Mhm.
worldview, and she's a very strong feminist in the good sense of that word.
Mm.
But she doesn't see she's just kind of blind to the fact that women are second class citizens in most Muslim countries, especially those that are majority Muslim and that are run by Sharia law. But it's her mindset, it's her worldview, and she also has that
Mm.
worldview that America is a very violent place and that it's very misogynistic and very
Yeah.
patriarchal and very racist. And it's in my view, it's a very disempowering
Yeah.
view to have of
And
the
not
of the
accurate,
world,
right? And
and
not
not accurate,
accurate. Yeah, and
not accurate. Yeah.
it reminds me of the studies that were done that I will now have to cite, but they were done on who has the more realistic view, the optimist or the pessimist. And what they discovered is that actually the optimist has the more realistic view because the pessimist is not as cognitively flexible and shuts out possibilities and so can't see reality for what it is. And I always think about this. I heard Michael Schellenberger talk at the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship. I heard a video of it this morning, and this made so much sense to me. Your cousin, my parents, my family, the people we know, are imposing an idea of utopia onto reality that is not accurate. And it's the idea that the US is this particular way, it's almost
Mm,
like a virtue if you see it this way. And if you see it this way, it's somehow more sophisticated than a naive, optimistic view.
hmm.
Do you see what I mean? I just think
Right.
that's
Yeah.
fascinating here. And that pretty much describes the progressive liberal agenda and the radical authoritarianism of it is that you will have this utopian view, our idea of utopia. And if you disagree with it, you are a bad person who should be excommunicated from your field or from activities. So it's a
Yeah.
utopian
And
dystopia.
in a more generic sense, I love that notion of like it's not sophisticated. So
Yeah.
you're kind of looked down on as you're not
Hmm.
quite thoughtful enough. The fact that you're willing to wave the American flag or cheer on a fighter jet that flies over you on the Fourth of July parade.
Yeah.
Which is interesting because my most liberal of friends, they admit to me, they say, "I got to tell you, when I see those F-35s flying overhead, I do get a chill at my spine in a positive way, right?" So they
Right.
they admit that even they have patriotism, and I think the point I want to make is none of this is to gloss over serious issues that we have in our society
Hmm.
as individuals and collectively that we need
Hmm.
to work on.
Right.
this isn't a my country right or wrong. This
Yeah.
is my country is a great country because I can criticize it whenever I want to. And I do, and a lot of people do, which is why over time it tends to improve, which is
Right.
why today we have a country where, you know, if you're a Muslim woman, you'd much prefer to live in the United States than you would in France, for instance. That's
Mm,
considered a very liberal country, very
mm,
left of center country, because your rights and freedoms to wear headdress
mhm,
here are essentially
mm,
unlimited,
mm.
whereas in France they're not. And if you're a woman, if you're a minority, you want to live in the United States. If you're a poor person, you want to live in the United States, and we see that by people who vote with their feet and try to come
Yeah.
across the border at any time. An exceptional country, and I believe in American exceptionalism, not from a religious perspective,
Mhm,
but from a perspective of it is exceptional, it is unique.
mhm.
And among Western nations, it's unique. And of course, among just nations globally, Western or non-Western, it's a very unique country, which is why the very people that the psychedelic movement pretends to care about, the
Mm,
minorities, the global
mm.
South, those are the people that are coming to the country that they are criticizing as being
Yeah.
so horrible that no one would want
Yeah.
to come to.
Well, and
It's an
that
interesting
brings
irony.
it is, of course, yeah, and we see that play out everywhere is, why fly the flag of your country that you fled from? Those protests that were happening last summer. Yeah,
Yeah.
in LA. But I guess all of this to sort of wrap up the conversation neatly with a bow, let's see if we can do that, is that I wonder what's going to happen when the Europeans, the visitors, go back. How will this shift their view? How will they bring this into their communities? Will it have any impact on anything? And my optimistic, realistic nature tells me from a humanitarian perspective that it will have a difference. It will make a difference in a small way in their communities, that maybe they won't be so pessimistic or have such filtered negative views of us. I don't know. What do you think the
Yeah.
impact is going to be?
No, I think so. If you think about what happened, why was the gay rights movement so successful so quickly? Because the leaders in that movement decided the best way to change hearts and minds was to personalize their
Mm,
experience as gays and graciously and compassionately talk to people who opposed their lifestyle with conversation and
mm,
like, oh, your uncle, and you know,
yeah.
I'm just an average Joe just like you. And within a decade, it's shocking if you look at the level of support that
Hmm.
for gay rights that occurred within about a 10 to 12 year period, because they were not adopting an anti-civilizational, anti-Western perspective, and they weren't shaming people that disagreed with them. They were engaging with them. And I think
That's
that's
so
what we need to
different.
do more of,
Yeah.
is engage. We just need to
Yeah.
engage, just like the Europeans. They'll go back and they'll
Yeah.
engage with their friends and they'll say, America's not the way we've been told it is.
So we're being humanized. I love how you have framed this in the using an analogy of gay rights. It seems so perfect that we're talking about conservatism and sensibility, and we're saying, yeah, we need to model what's happened with gay rights. I love that. I think that's great. And that if we can be humanized, then maybe we can start interacting not from an ideological perspective, but from a human perspective, which is similar to therapy. If you get rid of all the isms and the identities, then you're just dealing with a person who's in pain and you help them transcend that pain, which is what therapy has lost.
Hmm. And for those who think that there is not a monoculture, or that the predominant culture in the psychedelic community is not left of center, here's a quote by Terence McKenna, who's considered one of the intellectual leaders of the psychedelic movement. And he has hundreds of these quotes, but I'm just going to read one of them here. Western civilization is a loaded gun pointed at the head of this planet. He also comments about how Western civilization is on the verge of collapse. It's toxic. It leads to all of the ills that we have in our society today. And he's one of the main leaders. And I think you had mentioned one of the recently one of the MAPS guidelines. Can you
Mhm.
comment on that they had mentioned we needed to be sensitive toward sensitive toward BIPOC, or celebrate BIPOC, make sure that we weren't.
I'm trying to
What was the
remember in
exact?
what context, because there were two. The first one was a release on the MAPS website about being sure to honor and don't leave behind indigenous voices for the Ibogaine executive order.
Right,
So they're
right,
really,
exactly.
yeah, they're really organized around protecting that, which there are already international laws in place, and Africa has already set up the iboga as a national treasure. So they're taking care of themselves. We don't have to necessarily protect them for them. And then also in this month of June, there's a whole conversation around the oppressed peoples of the month of June and what that
That's right.
entails, and that we have
That
to
was
be
the one. That was the
careful
one.
to not oppress them more. And, they have equal
That's
rights.
it was that caveat. And it's interesting because not that that caveat's not important, but in the absence of there's no sense for maps that that type of a conversation somehow excludes more traditional people who don't feel that way, and or
Yeah.
imagine maps coming out with a statement commemorating the 250th anniversary
Yeah.
of America, and admonishing people to make sure to not forget
Yeah.
the traditions
Yeah.
of our
Of
ancestors
our
in America
ancestors.
and all the
Yeah.
great things that America has brought us. Well,
Can you
that's not going to
imagine?
happen because they
No.
don't have that worldview. And
Yeah.
that's, I think, what we're fundamentally arguing is not to not have comments and not to not have a focus or a conversation about everything, but it's actually, well, it is to have a conversation about
Yeah.
everything. And we're
Yeah.
not having a conversation about the glass being half full. We're only having a conversation about the glass being half empty,
Yeah.
totally empty, or broken.
Yeah.
And that's what I think we need to change within the psychedelic movement in order to broaden the tent, in order not just to have more diverse viewpoint, but I think it will be healthy for all those involved if we stop drinking our own bathwater and
Yeah.
thinking it tastes good. And we
Hmm.
step back from that and we realize that the world is a bigger place and there are a lot of perspectives out there that are valid and meaningful.
I love it. I think that's a
So,
great place to end. And we'll have
yeah.
we'll have more
Okay.
conversations coming up about all the different themes that came up in this. So
Okay.
our book is coming out soon, sensiblепsychedelicsbook.com, and you'll be able to join our newsletter and perhaps get a sneak peek and a lower price for the first little bit. So we'd love to have you join our little community. Hopefully not little
Excellent.
for a long time.
Good enough. All right. Thanks, Karen. Till
Bye.
next time.
Bye.